Occupied Europe, late summer, 1944. Night presses down on the town like a hell breath. The streets are empty, curfew tight, the windows darkened not by sleep, but by fear. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a German unit settles into its positions. Nearly 200 soldiers, rifles stacked, engines cooling, waiting for orders that will arrive not by voice, but by radio. Inside a narrow upstairs room, the air smells faintly of dust and warm metal. A single bulb hangs from the ceiling, its light kept low. On a wooden table sits a field radio, German issue, olive drab, its dials worn smooth by use. The set is alive with static, sharp and restless, like electricity scraping against silence. At the table sits a teenager, not a soldier, not trained in a barracks, still young enough that his hands have not lost their softness, yet steady enough to tune a frequency that German command believes is secure. Outside, boots scrape on cobblestones. A patrol passes. The radio crackles again. In this occupied town, authority does not come from uniforms or weapons. It comes from whoever controls the signal. And in this moment, the signal is about to change hands, quietly, invisibly, altering the fate of 200 armed men who have no idea their orders are no longer coming from Berlin, but from a boy in the dark. The radio hum deepens, and the war narrows to a single voice waiting to speak. Europe under occupation and the War of Signals. By 1944, the Second World War in Europe had entered a phase defined not only by armies and front lines, but by information. Across the continent, from the Atlantic coast to the forests of Eastern Europe, German forces occupied towns, rail junctions, ports, and communication hubs that were now more valuable than factories or fuel depots. Control of territory no longer depended solely on how many soldiers stood on the ground. It depended on how quickly orders could move through the air. Radio had become the nervous system of the German war machine. German field doctrine relied heavily on decentralized command, but only within strict communication frameworks. Battalion and company-sized units, often between 150 and 250 men, received their instructions through scheduled radio transmissions. These were not casual conversations. Frequencies were assigned. Call signs rotated. Time windows were fixed. A unit that missed its radio window was considered compromised or isolated, and isolation in occupied territory was dangerous. For occupation forces, radio control meant survival. In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and large parts of Poland, German garrisons were thinly spread. A town might be held by a few hundred soldiers, supported by collaborators and local police. Their strength came not from numbers, but from coordination. Orders to conduct arrests, respond to sabotage, or move against resistance cells arrived through radio messages relayed from regional command centers. Without those signals, even well-armed units could be rendered passive, uncertain whether to advance, hold, or retreat. The German High Command understood this vulnerability. From as early as 1941, directives were issued warning of enemy interception. The British had already demonstrated radio deception during operations in North Africa. By 1943, the Allies were running full-scale signal intelligence operations, and resistance movements inside occupied Europe were learning quickly. Radios were no longer just tools of communication. They were weapons. Yet the German system assumed one critical advantage: technical superiority and discipline. Field radios were standardized. Operators were trained. Code were changed regularly, sometimes daily. Authentication procedures, short verbal or numerical challenges, were meant to confirm that a message truly came from command. On paper, it was secure. Reality was messier. Resistance groups across Europe discovered that German occupation units often reused frequencies out of convenience. In quieter sectors, discipline slipped. Operators recognized familiar voices and trusted them. Authentication challenges were shortened or skipped entirely, especially during routine operations. A request to delay movement, an instruction to hold position, a confirmation that orders will follow. These small lapses created openings. The resistance understood something fundamental. They did not need to destroy German units. They only needed to confuse them, delay them, immobilize them at the right moment. A radio message that sounded correct, delivered at the correct time, on the correct frequency, could freeze 200 soldiers in place more effectively than an ambush. By 1944, resistance networks were actively hunting radios. Some were smuggled in by the British Special Operations Executive. Others were captured from German units during raids or abandoned retreats. A single functioning set could shift the balance in an entire district. But radios required operators, skilled ones, people who could tune frequencies by ear, recognize call signs, mimic procedures, and remain calm under the knowledge that discovery meant torture or execution. Adults were often too visible, too well known, too closely watched. Teenagers, however, moved differently through occupied towns. They ran errands, delivered food, passed checkpoints with less suspicion. And some of them, too young to be drafted, too old to be ignored, became the quiet technicians of the underground war. As German command traffic filled the airwaves night after night, the resistance began to understand the rhythm of occupation. And within that rhythm, a single interruption could echo far beyond one room, one town, or one radio set, toward a moment where control itself could be briefly, dangerously reassigned. The teenager, the network, and the price of knowledge. By the time the war reached its 5th year, resistance movements across occupied Europe had learned a hard truth. Courage alone was not enough. Survival depended on structure, secrecy, and specialization. Cells were kept small, often no more than 5 or 6 people. Members knew only what they needed to know. And within those cells, roles were assigned with ruthless practicality. Teenagers occupied a strange and dangerous space within this system. They were old enough to understand instructions, to memorize procedures, to keep secrets under pressure. Yet they were young enough to be overlooked. German patrols questioned men of military age aggressively. Women were watched for courier activity. Boys in their mid-teens, especially those running errands or working apprenticeships, slipped through gaps in suspicion. Resistance leaders noticed this early and used it carefully. Radio work was among the most perilous assignments available. German counterintelligence units, particularly the Gestapo and the Sicherheitsdienst, treated illegal radio operation as one of the gravest crimes under occupation law. Direction-finding vans roamed cities and towns, triangulating signals within minutes. A transmission that lasted too long could condemn an entire block. Training, therefore, was precise and restrained. Teenage recruits selected for radio work were not chosen at random. They were often mechanically inclined, accustomed to repairing bicycles, clocks, or household wiring. Some had pre-war experience as amateur radio listeners. Others learned from captured manuals and whispered instruction. They were taught to listen more than transmit, to recognize German call signs, to log patterns, to understand when silence was safer than action. They were also taught the consequences. Captured radio operators were rarely spared. Interrogations were systematic. Torture was routine. Execution followed swiftly once information was extracted. The resistance did not romanticize this. It was stated plainly, sometimes brutally, before a teenager was ever allowed near a transmitter. Participation was voluntary, but once accepted, there was no illusion of safety. The radio station itself, often little more than a field set wired to a battery or a generator, was never permanent. Locations changed constantly. Attics, basements, back rooms of shops, abandoned apartments. The equipment was concealed between uses. A teenager might assemble and disassemble the same set dozens of times, learning to do so in near darkness. In certain towns, German units operated their own localized command radios, particularly where infrastructure had been damaged or where Allied advances threatened regional command lines. These local stations handled routine orders, patrol schedules, response instructions, movement permissions. They were less rigorously monitored than higher-level command channels, and thus more vulnerable. The resistance paid close attention. Through weeks of listening, patterns emerged. Certain units reported at fixed times. Certain operators spoke in predictable phrases. Authentication challenges, when used, were often identical day after day. A teenage listener, patient and invisible, could learn the cadence of authority without ever speaking a word. By mid-1944, as Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy and Soviet armies advanced from the east, German occupation units were under growing strain. Command structures were overstretched. Officers rotated frequently. Fatigue eroded discipline. In this environment, the radio, once a symbol of control, became a point of fragility. For the teenager in the upstairs room, the war was no longer an abstract struggle of maps and headlines. It had become intimate, personal, reduced to the glow of a radio dial and the knowledge that 200 armed men, just streets away, were waiting for instructions that might soon come from the wrong source. All that remained was timing, and the decision of whether listening was enough or whether the moment had arrived to speak. For the teenager at the radio, fear was not dramatic. It was steady, functional, a presence that sharpened attention rather than overwhelming it. Every sound from a street below carried meaning. The pause of footsteps, the distant bark of a command, the clatter of a vehicle slowing near the building. Unlike armed fighters, radio operators could not run or fight their way out. Their defense was invisibility. Youth, in this context, was not innocence. It was adaptability. Teenagers learned quickly because they had to. Mistakes were not corrected. They were punished. The resistance did not encourage emotional attachment to outcomes. The goal was not heroism, but effect. If a message delayed a patrol for 10 minutes, that was enough. If it redirected a unit away from a raid, that was victory. Yet the weight of responsibility was immense. The teenager knew that a single spoken phrase, mispronounced or mistimed, could alert German operators that something was wrong. He also understood the moral gravity of the act. 200 soldiers were not abstract figures. They were men who would obey whatever came through the radio, whether it led them into safety or into confusion. There was no hatred in this work, only necessity. From a tactical standpoint, commandeering a radio frequency was a form of battlefield manipulation without gunfire. German units in occupied zones operated under strict rules of engagement. Unauthorized movement could trigger investigations or accusations of incompetence. This created a culture of hesitation. A clear radio order carried authority. Silence or contradiction created paralysis. A simple instruction, hold position, delay patrol, await further orders, could neutralize a company-sized unit for hours. During critical moments, such as Allied landings or resistance sabotage operations, those hours mattered. Roads went unguarded. Arrest lists went unexecuted. Supply columns waited instead of moving. The teenager's role was not to invent chaos, but to maintain plausibility. Orders had to sound routine, calm, boring. The most effective radio deception was the one that attracted no attention at all. German field radios were robust, reliable, and designed for ease of use. This reliability was both a strength and a weakness. Once a frequency was known and a procedure understood, the equipment did not distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate voices. There was no encryption in the modern sense, only codes, call signs, and trust. Resistance operators exploited this. They kept transmissions brief to avoid detection. They used the same terminology German operators used. They avoided giving complex instructions. The radio did not care who spoke, only that the signal matched expectation. In that small room, technology collapsed hierarchy. Rank dissolved into sound waves. A teenager, properly trained and perfectly timed, could momentarily occupy the same authority as a German officer miles away. And in that fragile overlap between trust and assumption, the conditions for a turning point quietly took shape. In traditional military structures, authority flowed from insignia and seniority. In the occupied territories, resistance leadership functioned differently. Orders were not enforced, they were entrusted. For a teenager to be placed at a radio set during a sensitive operation meant that experienced leaders had already accepted a profound risk. They could not supervise the moment itself. Once the signal went out, control was surrendered. This was leadership stripped to its essence, preparation followed by trust. The teenager had been taught not just how to operate the radio, but when not to use it. Silence, restraint, and judgment were considered marks of maturity. In this environment, leadership was measured by outcomes, not age. If the transmission achieved its objective without exposure, it was correct. If it endangered the network, it was failure, regardless of intention. This quiet delegation of authority revealed a deeper truth about resistance warfare. Survival demanded that hierarchy give way to competence, and competence could emerge anywhere. German occupation forces were trained to expect external threats, armed attacks, sabotage, assassinations. Internal disruption, especially from voices that sounded familiar, was harder to detect. Radio operators recognized patterns. They trusted accents. They relied on routine. A calm voice issuing an unremarkable order was more convincing than urgency or aggression. This trust created a blind spot. German doctrine emphasized obedience to command, and disobedience carried consequences. When an order arrived that aligned with expectation, delay, hold, await confirmation, it was followed without question. To challenge it required confidence and initiative, qualities eroded by fatigue and fear of reprimand. Thus, deception thrived not through brilliance, but through conformity. Issuing false orders did not feel like victory in the moment. It felt heavy. The teenager understood that the men on the other end of the transmission would act in good faith. They were following what they believed to be lawful commands. The act was not personal, but it was intimate. Resistance doctrine addressed this indirectly. The objective was not to cause unnecessary harm, but to reduce it. Immobilizing a unit could prevent shootings, arrests, and reprisals. A delayed patrol could save lives without firing a shot. Radio deception, when successful, was among the least violent tools available. Still, the responsibility lingered. Once spoken, words could not be recalled. The signal moved outward, invisible and irreversible. As night deepened and transmission windows approached, all these angles, human fear, tactical opportunity, technological vulnerability, delegated leadership, enemy assumption, and moral restraint, converged around a single decision point. The radio was no longer just an object to be understood. It was a lever waiting to be pulled. The transmission window opened precisely on time. German field radios operated on schedules that were as habitual as roll call. At a fixed hour, the frequency came alive. Static gave way to clipped voices, call signs exchanged with mechanical certainty. Somewhere beyond the town, an officer checked his watch. Somewhere closer, 200 soldiers paused their routines, waiting for confirmation of what the night would bring. In the upstairs room, the teenager listened first. Always listening, he waited for the familiar cadence, the call sign he had heard dozens of times before, the operator whose voice carried authority through repetition rather than volume. The response came as expected. Routine, unhurried. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. German radio procedure relied on the assumption that if a message arrived within the correct time window, on the correct frequency, using the correct format, it was legitimate. Authentication challenges, when used, were brief. A numerical exchange, a confirmation phrase. The resistance had memorized them through weeks of interception. The teenager adjusted the dial minutely. The radio's hum settled into clarity. When he pressed the transmit switch, there was no tremor in his voice. Not because fear was absent, but because fear had already been accounted for. The words were chosen in advance. Short, indistinct, entirely unremarkable. The message did not command action. It delayed it. The instruction aligned perfectly with expectation. Hold position. Await further orders. Maintain readiness. Nothing urgent. Nothing suspicious. Just enough authority to stop movement without provoking curiosity. On the receiving end, the German operator acknowledged. The exchange ended. The channel returned to static. It lasted less than 30 seconds. But within those seconds, the balance of initiative shifted. A company-sized unit, positioned to respond to resistance activity or allied movement, was now anchored in place by a voice that had no uniform and no rank. The teenager released the transmit switch and did not move. Procedure dictated silence after transmission. Any additional signal increased the risk of detection. The radio cooled. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Outside, the town remained quiet. But beneath that stillness, consequences were already unfolding. Orders obeyed, movements postponed, decisions deferred by men who believed they were following the will of command. The first phase was complete. What followed would determine whether confusion remained temporary or became decisive. When confusion became control, minutes passed, then more. In German operational terms, delay created a vacuum. A unit instructed to hold position could not act independently without risking disciplinary consequences. Officers waited for confirmation. Patrol leaders stood down. Vehicles remained idle. The absence of movement was, in itself, a form of obedience. Across the town, resistance activity unfolded within that pause. Couriers crossed streets that would normally be watched. A weapons cache was relocated. A lookout post was abandoned without replacement. None of these actions were dramatic on their own. Together, they altered the tactical landscape. The German unit, nearly 200 strong, remained unaware that its inertia was artificial. As the next scheduled transmission window approached, the teenager listened again. The radio came alive with routine traffic, status reports, confirmations, acknowledgments. The absence of concern confirmed success. No suspicion had been raised. No counter-challenges issued. The deception had blended seamlessly into expectation. A second message was prepared, even more restrained than the first. It did not redirect the unit. That would have invited scrutiny. Instead, it reinforced the pause. Orders were under review. Higher command was occupied. Maintain readiness. Await further instruction. The phrasing mirrored dozens of authentic German messages recorded earlier. Nothing in it demanded urgency. Once again, the channel fell silent. At a higher level, German command structures were already strained. Allied pressure forced rapid redeployments. Communication lines were crowded. A delayed unit did not immediately stand out. Reports accumulated. Clarifications were postponed. In the fog of administrative overload, the absence of movement registered as compliance, not failure. For several critical hours, the unit remained fixed. Only later, well after the resistance had completed its objectives, did questions begin to surface. Why had no patrols moved? Why had no follow-up reports been sent? By then, the moment had passed. The advantage was gone. What remained was uncertainty. Counterintelligence teams would later examine logs, compare call signs, and interrogate operators. They would suspect interception, perhaps even internal compromise. But they would not identify a teenager in an upstairs room because the operation left no visible trace. No shots fired, no alarms raised, Only silence where movement had been expected. As the radio was dismantled and concealed, the teenager understood that the act itself would never be recorded in official histories. There would be no medals, no citations. Success, in this form of warfare, meant remaining unknown. And yet, in that narrow slice of time, control had changed hands. Not through force, but through trust exploited and routine manipulated. The war moved on. Front lines shifted. But for those 200 soldiers, the night remained a blank space in the record, a period of waiting whose cause they would never fully understand. What followed would not be immediate retribution, but something quieter and more enduring. The consequences of realizing that even authority could be imitated. Suspicion, silence, and the machinery of repression. The aftermath did not arrive with sirens or gunfire. It came later, folded into paperwork, carried in quiet conversations between officers, and expressed through changes in procedure that spread across occupied territory without explanation. For the German command, the night itself appeared uneventful. No ambush had occurred. No installations were lost. And yet something was wrong. The first indications surfaced in routine reports. A regional operations officer noticed that a company listed as on standby had remained in that status longer than expected. There were no patrol logs for several hours. No movement records. No requests for clarification. At first, this registered as administrative delay, hardly unusual in late 1944, when command systems were stretched thin and personnel were constantly reassigned. But patterns mattered. When similar delays appeared elsewhere, suspicion sharpened. German counterintelligence units were trained to look for absence as much as presence. A missed report could be coincidence. Repeated stillness suggested interference. Radios, once trusted as instruments of order, began to appear less certain. An internal inquiry followed. Operators were questioned, not aggressively at first, but methodically. They were asked to recount transmission times, call signs, authentication phrases. Most answers aligned. The messages received had sounded correct. The phrasing had been familiar. Nothing had triggered alarm in the moment. That was precisely the problem. German doctrine relied on predictability. When predictability was used against it, the system struggled to respond. Investigators could not easily distinguish between legitimate delays caused by higher command confusion and deliberate deception from below. The war had grown too large, too chaotic for certainty. As a precaution, new directives were issued. Authentication procedures were reinforced. Transmission windows were shortened. Operators were instructed to challenge any order that deviated, even slightly, from expectation. In theory, security tightened. In practice, the added complexity slowed communication further, increasing hesitation rather than eliminating vulnerability. On the ground, the atmosphere changed. Occupation troops grew more rigid, less flexible. Officers hesitated to make independent decisions, fearing reprimand. Patrols were delayed, while confirmations were sought. This caution, intended to prevent deception, often achieved the opposite. It created openings. Resistance groups noticed the change immediately. Movement became easier in some areas, not harder. Repression, however, followed close behind. German authorities rarely accepted uncertainty without retaliation. Even when evidence was lacking, suspicion demanded action. Raids increased. Buildings were searched for hidden transmitters. Direction-finding units swept neighborhoods. Anyone suspected of technical knowledge, electricians, radio repairmen, even curious adolescents, fell under scrutiny. Teenagers, once overlooked, were no longer invisible. Schools were monitored. Apprenticeships questioned. Youth movements infiltrated. The occupiers understood that age no longer guaranteed insignificance. The realization unsettled them. It suggested a war being fought beneath the surface of daily life, in places authority could not easily see. Within resistance networks, News of the operation spread carefully, stripped of detail. Successes were shared without attribution. Names were never spoken. The teenager's role remained known only to a handful of coordinators, and even they avoided repetition. Survival depended on forgetfulness as much as memory. The radio itself was dismantled and moved within hours. Components were separated, hidden in different locations. Batteries were drained and discarded. Wires were repurposed. Nothing remained in the room that could explain what had happened. The space returned to normal: a bedroom, a storeroom, an empty attic. For the teenager, there was no immediate celebration. Aftermath meant waiting, listening for footsteps, watching faces in the street for signs of recognition. Each knock at the door carried possibility. Each delay in routine felt significant. The war, for him, had narrowed further, not to a radio, but to endurance. German command would never publicly acknowledge the incident. Official reports spoke only of communication irregularities and procedural review. The truth that authority had been convincingly imitated by someone without rank, age, or uniform remained unspoken. And yet, beneath the silence, the implication lingered. If a single voice could immobilize 200 soldiers, what else might be vulnerable? The occupation had always relied on the appearance of control. After that night, the appearance remained, but the certainty beneath it had cracked, just slightly, enough for doubt to seep in. That doubt would shape everything that followed: legacy, survival, and the quiet record of impact. In the months that followed, the war accelerated beyond the control of any single radio set or local command post. Allied armies advanced. German units withdrew, regrouped, or collapsed under pressure. Towns that had lived for years under occupation shifted hands in days or hours. Against this scale of movement, the radio incident faded into operational noise. But its effects did not disappear. German occupation doctrine changed in subtle ways. Field reports increasingly emphasized verification, redundancy, and centralized authorization. These measures reflected a growing anxiety about internal reliability. The enemy was no longer assumed to be only outside the perimeter. It might already be listening. For resistance networks, the incident became part of an evolving understanding of modern warfare. It confirmed what many had suspected, that control of information could be as decisive as control of territory. Radios were treated with new respect. Training expanded. Listening posts multiplied. Deception, once a rare opportunity, became a recognized tactic. The teenager did not remain a radio operator indefinitely. The risk grew too high. After the operation, he was reassigned, or in some cases, simply told to stop. Survival often required disappearance. Some returned to ordinary routines, carrying knowledge that could not be shared. Others moved on to courier work or intelligence gathering. A few were evacuated or absorbed into regular forces as the front lines shifted. What united them was silence. Official recognition rarely followed. Resistance warfare depended on anonymity. Many operations were never documented, either because records were destroyed or because no one dared create them. Post-war histories favored large battles and named leaders. The quiet manipulation of a frequency, the immobilization of a unit through routine language, did not fit heroic narratives. And yet, its impact was measurable. A delayed unit meant a successful sabotage elsewhere. A missed patrol meant lives spared. A few hours of stillness could ripple outward, shaping events that never traced their origin back to a radio in a dark room. This was the arithmetic of resistance. Small actions multiplied by circumstance. After liberation, German officers interviewed by Allied intelligence occasionally mentioned unexplained delays, confusing orders, or moments when authority seemed intact but outcomes were wrong. These accounts were rarely pursued. There were larger questions to answer, larger crimes to document. The war had left little room for ambiguity. The teenager, now older, carried the experience forward without markers. No uniform had ever defined his role. No record captured his voice on the airwaves. What remained was memory, of concentration, of restraint, of a moment when power briefly aligned with preparation rather than force. In this, the episode reflected a broader truth about the war in occupied Europe. Victory was not always achieved through confrontation. Often, it emerged from patience, technical understanding, and the willingness to act precisely when systems assume compliance. The radio, once a symbol of centralized control, had revealed its weakness. It could transmit authority, but it could not verify intent. By the time the war ended, that lesson had been learned at great cost on all sides. Communication security became doctrine. Authentication grew complex. Trust narrowed. The modern battlefield, shaped by signals and interception, was already taking form. For the teenager who had spoken once and then fallen silent, the war did not end with celebration. It ended with continuity, life resuming around an act that would never be publicly named, but that had mattered nonetheless. And in the vast ledger of the conflict, where millions of decisions overlapped, that mattered more than recognition. The quiet power of information in war. The war had always been a contest of force, territory, and strategy, but it was also a war of information. The story of a teenager at a radio set, unseen and unheard, reminds us that influence does not always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it moves in waves of static, in the careful modulation of voice, in the precise timing of a signal. In that narrow room, control shifted not through firepower but through knowledge. 200 soldiers obeyed orders they believed legitimate, their authority borrowed from expectation, trust, and habit. The act was invisible, temporary, and uncredited, and yet it altered outcomes in a real, measurable way. It demonstrated the fragility of systems built on assumption, the vulnerability of command that cannot verify intent, and the extraordinary impact of courage married to skill. History often celebrates generals, battles, and conquests. Yet moments like this reveal another layer. The war waged in shadows, on rooftops, in attics by those too young to hold rifles yet old enough to understand responsibility. The teenager's decision, calibrated and restrained, reminds us that human agency, even in the smallest form, can resonate far beyond immediate perception. It also carries a philosophical weight. War is not only about destruction, but about choices, ethical, tactical, and practical. To deceive without violence, to immobilize without confrontation, is a rare form of power. It forces reflection on the nature of authority, the trust we place in systems, and the subtle ways ordinary people shape extraordinary events. Ultimately, the story closes with a quiet truth. The war for those 200 soldiers was paused by a boy who had learned to listen, to measure, to act with precision. For the teenager, the war was defined by restraint, patience, and courage hidden beneath routine. And for history, it is a reminder that even the smallest interventions, careful, deliberate, and unseen, can ripple across time, influencing the course of events in ways that guns and armies cannot always achieve. Control, after all, is never absolute. It is measured in moments, and sometimes the smallest moment carries the greatest weight.